From what we have said, I believe we have established that the first pillar is not particularly sound. What about the second pillar? The pillar of language and style. Well, the general response is, why couldn't an Israelite author vary his style and choice of words from passage to passage, depending on his purpose and message? Moreover, why couldn't an author break up a lengthy story with a digression? And could not that digression have been a part of his style rather than evidence of sources? One can have variations in language and style without positing different authors or different sources. Does different vocabulary demand different authors? Cassuto argues that, like the divine names, some of these word pairs are not really interchangeable, but some will be preferable in some contexts, while others will be preferable in other contexts. For example, is there a real difference between create and form? Well, you use the word bara, create, when you don't mention the material out of which you create something. Whereas form, yatsar, you will tend to use when you're referring to the material. You form from something using potter clay type imagery, actually. And so the choice is what you want to say, not the sources. What about Amorite or Canaanite? Wybray suggests that these terms may have had connotations that now escape us, connotations that led to different terms being used in different contexts. What about cut or establishing covenants? Karat means to cut a covenant. They're both translate make. Hakim means to establish, a hithiel of kum if you're into Hebrew. Well, it means two different things, says Cassuto. To cut a covenant is to give certain assurances. That is, if you make this covenant with me, I will do X, Y, and Z. But to establish a covenant means the actual fulfillment of what was assured. To confirm a covenant, that is giving X, Y, or Z. Or sometimes it's renewing a covenant. The point is that these terms may well not be simply interchangeable. Arguments from style can also go against the JEDP theory. P and J have identical styles, says Wybray. P has a style that cannot be distinguished from J other than the divine name. And as Wybray puts it, this fact is generally unperceived, ignored, or implausibly explained away by writers on this subject. Another factor, after the exile, Aramaic became a very important language and influencing even Hebrew. If P were really a post-exilic work, you would expect it to show more Aramaic influence, but it does not show any Aramaic influence. The lack of Aramaisms suggests a pre-exilic date for P. Thus, the second pillar from language and style also proves unsound. But what about the third pillar? The third pillar is contradictions. And the general response is that the various alleged contradictions can usually be plausibly harmonized or explained without positing that there is actually a contradiction there. For example, the question of, were plants made before mankind, as Genesis 1, the P account says, or was it after mankind, as Genesis 2 seems to say? Genesis 2:5 says that no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. Now, Casuto argues that the first plant is actually a plant that has to do with thorns. The second plant, translated in the, I'm reading the English Standard Version, small plant, has to do with plants that require cultivation, like barley and grains. And thorns and herbs later become a part of the curse on man, thorns to trouble him and herbs to sustain him outside, where by the sweat of his brow he will earn his living. But these were not necessary yet in the Garden of Eden before the fall. But all the other plants could well have already been created. Moreover, the context may be limited just to the Garden of Eden. Outside there may have been thorns and thistles and grains, but not in the Garden of Eden. Even in the Garden of Eden, it may mean something, the word translated small plant, or referring to grains, may refer to fields of grain. There may have been individual barley or wheat plants, but there were no fields of it because man had not yet been created to cultivate the land in that way. What about the forming of animals before man, as Genesis 1, the so-called P account says, or forming the animals after man, as Genesis 2 would seem to indicate? And it turns out that there are at least three plausible explanations for this. One explanation is that the creation of animals after man in Genesis 2 may be a special case for the Garden of Eden. There may have been other animals outside of the garden, but God made animals, for some additional animals for Adam to name. That's one possibility. Another possibility relates to how the NIV has translated Genesis 2:19. It translates it as a flashback, what we'll call later synoptic resumptive expansive storytelling. It translates it as a pluperfect, that God had formed out of the ground all the beasts of the field and all the birds of the air. Other versions would say that simply that God formed, as if it were the next thing, but they translate it as if it's flashing back to Genesis 1. And if you translate it that way, then there's no problem, no contradiction. But my teacher, Hanan Brichto of Hebrew Union College, pointed this out. He said that mankind was made after the animals in Genesis 1, but it's mankind, man is male and female. And even in Genesis 2, man is male and female only occurs after the other animals are made and named by Adam. In other words, Eve comes after the animals even there, and therefore man as male and female comes after the animals. And again, since there's no contradiction, there's no need to posit different sources on the basis of contradiction. Moreover, source critics miss a literary style known as synoptic resumptive expansive storytelling. Or we'll simplify that, we'll just call it resumptive repetition. Resumptive repetition is a very common style in biblical narratives, though source critics, and to be honest, many conservatives tend to miss it. The technique is to tell a story once and then to flash back and retell the story again, either to expand on it or to tell the story from a different point of view. Source critics wrongly see the two as conflicting or divergent sources whenever this happens. So when you tell a story once and then you tell it again, well, it must be two different authors, two different sources. But rather, this can be a literary technique practiced by one author, a single author, and is a technique akin to flashback. And the very first example of it happens in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I posit to you that this is not the first thing that happens in creation. This is a summary of the whole account. And then the 6 days that follow represents a resumptive and expansive telling of that story. We'll continue this in the next lecture.